Hi, my name is Josh Thompson. My pronouns are he, him, and today I'm going to be talking to you about supporting and affirming LGBTQ students. Before I get started, I do ask that you not take pictures or screenshots of these slides. This work is my intellectual property. If you do want to use any of my work, please be sure to cite me. I want to begin by honoring and acknowledging the land that I'm presenting from today. I live and work on the stolen land of the Tutelo. Any collective liberation work must acknowledge the land and the harmful effects of settler colonialism, and then work to disrupt and dismantle it. When I thought of what I wanted to say to you today, I kept coming back to my own story. As a gay man who grew up a closeted gay boy in a conservative area of southwestern Virginia, I never saw that part of my identity reflected anywhere, not in the world I lived in, the media we consumed, or the curricula I was taught with. In fact, it wasn't until I went to college that I encountered any significant queer representation. Knowing how isolating and harmful it can be for LGBTQ students to not see themselves anywhere in a school, I now aim to be the openly gay teacher that I never had, but that I so needed. I share my story today to show how this work of supporting and affirming LGBTQ students is especially pressing for queer educators, and how it can be at times particularly challenging for those of us in the LGBTQ community. And I acknowledge the incredible amount of privilege that I still have as a white, cisgender, thin, able-bodied, neurotypical, English-speaking American man born, raised, and working in the United States. The personal is political, and by sharing my story today, I provide a counter-narrative to challenge heteronormativity and homophobia. And as a cisgender accomplice to transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, and gender-expansive folks, I also take a stand against cisnormativity and transphobia. As I said, I grew up in a small town in Patrick County called Ararat, Virginia. Even people who live nearby have never heard of it. My family surrounded me with love. Being raised by a single mom for the majority of my childhood taught me the power of a mother's unconditional love. We may not always have had much money, but I knew I had her support and the support of the rest of my family. Throughout my time in K-12 education, they were at every event I was a part of. I always knew I could find them in the audience for band concerts and theater performances, and in the bleachers for marching band halftime shows and competitions. And because my family lived, and to this day still lives close to each other, I saw my grandparents, aunts, and cousins nearly every day. We also had the typical Southern American Sunday dinner, so I shared a meal with my extended family every week. Like I said, I always knew I had their support, except in one very big way. I knew I was gay from a young age, and I also knew that I shouldn't talk about it. The implicit messages that I received from the media and from school told me almost instinctively that I had to keep that part of my identity hidden, and I protected that secret at all costs. Since then, I have come out to my family, and they all accept me for who I am, and they still love me, which is something that I wish I can go back and tell my 5-year-old self. Yeah, I've known that I'm gay since kindergarten, even before most likely, which is an experience common to many LGBTQ folks. It also stresses the importance of this work for primary and elementary school educators. And as a closeted gay student, I never saw myself reflected in any curricula from kindergarten to 12th grade. Well, that's not entirely true. In my 11th grade honors English class, I chose to write an essay on Adrienne Rich's poem, Living in Sin. But I only learned about her queer identity through my own research. I talked to my teacher about it, and we had that conversation, but it was in a private moment. Adrienne Rich's queerness was not made part of any whole class conversation. If you would have met me in high school, here's what you would have seen. I excelled in all my classes. I had a lot of friends from groups all across the school. I was your typical band and theater kid. I even lettered in marching band, and I rocked that letter jacket. You probably would have thought that I was completely happy and outgoing, that I was a student who had it all together. And in many ways I did, but I was also incredibly alone. I didn't know any other LGBTQ people. My teachers never talked about queer issues in class. We never read works by LGBTQ authors. I never knew LGBTQ history or the incredible contributions that queer people have made to the world. It wasn't until I was an undergrad at Virginia Tech that I started to feel less alone. In fact, Nikki Giovanni was the first professor who made me feel affirmed as a gay student. So now I am that openly queer teacher that I needed but never had in school. And to the end of helping other educators support and affirm LGBTQ students, I have 3 suggestions. Educate yourself. Create a welcoming, inclusive, and supportive classroom environment. and make your curricula affirming of LGBTQ students. First, educate yourself. Research the LGBTQ history of the country, region, and city or town you live and teach in. Knowing where people have been gives you context for the work moving forward. If you're unfamiliar with terminology and concepts, educate yourself. There are plenty of resources out there like Teaching Tolerance and GLSEN. To not know is no longer an acceptable excuse. I also want to encourage folks to do an inventory of the people you interact with and the media you consume. In the words of my friend and fellow educator, Jessica Matthews, diversify yourself. Do you listen to and learn from LGBTQ people? Are you reading LGBTQ stories written by queer authors? Do the podcasts you listen to and the TV shows and movies you watch center LGBTQ people? And also keep Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality in mind. Make sure that you're learning about and from queer Black folks and queer Indigenous folks, queer Latina folks, queer folks of Asian descent, queer disabled folks, queer fat folks, as well as the specific issues affecting each of those various communities. Queerness is not a monolith. And we all have to do critical self-reflection of our own biases and interrogate the ways in which cis heteronormativity has worked on us as individuals as well as societies. This self-reflection and interrogation is a lifelong process and exceptionally important work in supporting and affirming LGBTQ students. As my friend and fellow teacher Trisha Barvia says, we bring all of our identities and the experiences that inform them into our teaching. So we have to interrogate the ways in which these experiences have shaped our practices and our relationships with kids. Like with all other forms of systemic oppression, an educator who has not done this internal work, who then goes about the work of supporting LGBTQ students, is dangerous. The second way in which teachers can affirm LGBTQ students is by creating welcoming, inclusive classroom environments. And here I want to push back on a term that's often used when we talk about inclusive classroom cultures: safe space. The fact of the matter is that no space is completely safe for LGBTQ students when schools operate within the oppressive system of cis heteronormativity. But we can create spaces in which students feel supported and affirmed, and then brave enough to be who they are. One way of doing this is through language. For example, teachers should model proper pronoun usage. At the beginning of every semester or year or term, include a question on student surveys that asks for their pronouns, as well as if there are any situations in which students want you to use different pronouns, like between home and at school. And then actually use those pronouns, and also call students by their names. It's critical in supporting trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and gender expansive students. When the caregivers, teachers, and peers around them use their chosen names, these students experience a lower risk for depression and suicidal ideation. Cisgender educators especially can disrupt cis normativity by stating our pronouns when we introduce ourselves, by posting our pronouns on a sign next to our nameplates outside our classroom doors, and by putting our pronouns in our email signatures. And we all need to embrace the use of the singular they. Prescriptive grammarians need not at me. Another powerful way to affirm LGBTQ students is to talk about queer people and issues in class. When we don't talk about them, or we do so only in private, or we just ignore them altogether, we send the message to LGBTQ students that their humanity isn't valued. And do not refer to texts featuring LGBTQ lives and experiences as controversial. The insinuation there is that LGBTQ people ourselves are controversial, and we are not. LGBTQ students also need to hear and see us standing up against homophobia, transphobia, and all other forms of hate. Students have to trust that we will stand up for them before they feel comfortable enough in our classrooms. And lastly, we create inclusive spaces when we build and maintain positive relationships with students. They know we care about them and that we see them in their entire selves through our actions. And when we build these relationships with them, we send a powerful message that we honor and affirm who they are. Look, when we're talking about centering students, we have to center all parts of students. We do not get to pick and choose which elements of students' identities we honor. Finally, LGBTQ students have to see themselves in curricula. When I think back to my own education, I was so isolated in part because I never saw my gay identity reflected in any of my classes. If I had, I know it would have made a huge difference. And I know the same applies to LGBTQ students. This process of incorporating LGBTQ content is going to look differently depending on which subject you teach, but all educators can take some similar steps. To start, assess the texts and resources you use. Ask yourself whose voices and experiences are heard and seen and whose are left out. And then find texts and resources that fill in those gaps. We send a clear message to students about who matters and who doesn't by what we teach. They learn who is valued and who is not valued in our culture through these implicit and, let's face it, sometimes explicit messages. And as you go about making your curriculum more inclusive and affirming of LGBTQ students, make sure you represent the complexity of queer experiences. Yeah, LGBTQ people have had to fight and struggle for our rights to be seen and to be valued as humans, and we still do to this day. But there is also so much incredible strength and joy. One great example of an LGBTQ affirming educational space that highlights the joyful richness and complexity of queer experiences is the work of my friends and fellow educators Shay Martin and Cody Miller. Together, they created Love and Literary, a book club for LGBTQ high school students. The stories they have already shared from their first meetings are testaments to the power of inclusive educational environments and queer representation in curricula. Make sure that students leave your classes knowing the power in queer strength and joy. Our happiness and our pleasure, the very act of existing in that strength and joy in a world that tries to deny us our humanity and even our lives, is an act of resistance and revolution. I could speak for hours about supporting and affirming LGBTQ students, but I'm only going to speak to 2 more points. It is an awesome experience to be able to stand beside other queer teachers in this work. So I want to give huge shout outs right now to Shay Martin, Key Gross, Victoria Thompson, Patrick Harris, Jess Lipschitz, Lizzie Fortin, and Cody Miller. This work requires community, and I feel so lucky to be in community with them. Shay Martin reminds me to dream, to go beyond the confines of oppressive systems like white supremacy, racism, anti-blackness, fat phobia, ableism, sexism, and cis heteronormativity. So let me leave you by asking you to dream. What would happen if queer kids could see the beauty and joy of who they are reflected every day in their schools? How awesomely different would our world be if queer kids were affirmed in such a way that they could thrive in their queerness instead of having to hide it? How much power, joy, and creativity would there be if we all dismantled binary thinking in our everyday lives? What if we also removed its place in schools and classrooms? What if educators didn't police children simply for existing? What if educators were also given ample time and resources and the pay we deserve so that we too felt supported? What if schools actually helped all students learn and grow to the best of their abilities instead of saying they do, while failing queer kids and Black kids and Indigenous kids and Latina kids and Asian kids and disabled kids and neurotypical kids and fat kids and homeless kids and so many others? Imagine how transformative it would be if we dismantled the system of schooling as we know it, if we eradicated the influences of systemic oppression embedded within it, and then we rebuilt something that worked for everyone, something that centered the most marginalized. Imagine what it would look like. Imagine what it would feel like. This dreaming involves dismantling systemic oppression in all its forms, but schools and classrooms are an excellent place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Josh, for that powerful, powerful message, the powerful experience of learning. I would ask that maybe our audience now kind of join us in a conversation, discussion, some questions and answers with Josh. Please encourage you to, you know, turn on your video, so that we can see your face, so that we can be together in this wonderful moment. So Josh, we got a lot of we got comments coming in the chat about how powerful, how well done your conversation were. I know I took several notes. Um, so I'm going to start us off, and then hopefully maybe some of our listeners will give some additional questions in the chat. But can you speak maybe a little bit more to that difference between the safe space that inclusive schools often preach to that brave space, to where we can bring all of our intersectional identities with us, and our students can too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, this is something that I've over the past maybe year or so have really realized, thanks to a lot of my friends and my teacher community, especially on Twitter. I think a lot of times we all as teachers like to assume that kids will just, oh, you're my teacher and you're going to be safe for me. But I think that uh, oh, well, and a lot of it does come from a place of privilege as well. I think if you do share marginalized identities with kids, you've been there, you understand what that's like. So, I mean, to assume that a kid's going to just say, "Oh, you're my teacher. This is a safe place," for us to call it safe, we completely ignore any sort of past experiences that kids may have had with other teachers. We are our own individual selves, and we also are cogs in the machine of the entire system as well. And so we have to remember that too. And I mean, what I said in there, it's the fact of the matter is, like, schools operate within all kinds of oppressive systems. It's not just cis heteronormativity, it's racism, it's white supremacy. I mean, it's so many of these things. And it just, there's no way we can call it safe, but we can build those relationships with kids and make them feel, build that trust with them so that they do then want to share. And I like calling it a brave space because it really is. I mean, it is brave, even for me to share, to come out, because it's this continuous thing of coming out to new people. Even if I do feel like I trust you, it's still a brave thing to put myself out there. And it's amplified for kids. So, and I mean, that's something, I think, by calling it that brave space, it also highlights just those systems again, and the ways in which they work within our relationship with kids.
As a fellow gay man myself, I know that I still kind of bring some of that heteronormativity to my role as teacher often, and it's something that I even, as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, have to be aware and to recognize. How do you make sure that you're not norming heteronormativity, um, even as a gay man in your classroom?
Yeah, I mean, it in the beginning it was hard. I mean, even if you are part of a marginalized community, like, there's still, I mean, it works on so many of our internal biases. Um, I mean, as I said in there, I mean, I'm going to expand it to cis heteronormativity as well, because those two things really do operate hand in hand. I mean, just the very fact that I, as a cis man, could just say, "Hi, here are my pronouns." Right. I mean, that is very powerful to normalize that, and then to talk about people, or talk to people about why that is so important. Um, I mean, I don't assume that, if a kid's like, "Oh yeah, like I'm going on a date," I don't go, "Okay, well, if it's a girl, I don't say, well, what's his name?" I'm like, "Oh, well, like, what's their name?" And those, very subtle ways. As a English teacher, I often do book talks, and we're always like, "This is a book. It features a lesbian character, and she does these lesbian things, and lesbian, but we don't go, here's this straight girl and she does straight things and straight." So I've also I learned that from Cody Miller. I mean, I've started to do that as well, and I do that with every single identity marker there is out there. And that just also is a way not to just assume. If we have any, elementary or primary teachers out there, a powerful way that you could do that is not to separate by boys and girls. Don't be like, boys over here, girls over there. or to look at a kid and say, oh, you're going to be a lady killer when you grow up. Like I had that said to me and I'm like, no.
Yeah, and even how about some of the language that when we talk about families and such, that we'll say, mom and dad often, and we lose that aspect of multiple moms or multiple dads, and or even single parentism and such.
Yeah. So I mean that in there, I often just say, your parents or even caregivers is a word that I've started. Dulce Marie Fletcher. She's a lot of work with like trauma informed education, and she has spent a lot of time with kids who often have so many different types of families, and she really has pushed my thinking on more of caregivers rather than parent or parents.
I like that. We do have a question. How can we face parent and school management criticism? Again, when maybe they don't see it necessarily as just not controversial, as you mentioned in the video.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that question got brought up because it's one, when I was making that keynote, I'm like, I had this long list of things I wanted to say and I had 15 minutes. So I think first and foremost, I mean, if you can get your administration, on board and support with that, I mean, that goes a long way. And the teaching tolerance resource, it's I referenced it in the talk. It's a guide for best practices for supporting LGBTQ students. They have an entire page about ways in which you can work within these, potential pushbacks you might get. And I think I see Judy Diggs is in here. She's the director of diversity and inclusion for my county, and we work a lot together. And she's been like pushing this thing recently of we are promoting human values, and I think I just when she said it, I was like, oh my gosh, that's what it is. Like, yes, it's supporting LGBTQ students, but it's supporting human values. I mean, and I also have had really great success by centering students. I mean, this is going to support students. I just keep coming back to, hey, this is going to support students. Even this year, I had a student, we were reading an essay by James Baldwin, and I asked him to research him because the phenomenal gay, Black, male writer that he is, we don't often read him enough in schools, at least in the US. And I wanted the students to find that out themselves at first. And then we talked about it in class and really centered that identity. But I had a student email me and say, I really don't think this is appropriate for school, and, listed all these things. And I talked to my principal, it's the first person I talked to. And she helped me kind of work through it. I responded and I affirmed everything he had said. I'm like, yes, like he is this gay Black writer, and in addition to that, he's an award-winning writer, and we're reading this essay because of the way in which he uses description very effectively. That's why we're reading it. We're not that's what we're focusing on. But if you'd like, here's an alternative assignment. So you have to offer those up. My principal said, is this the hill you want to die on? And I was like, no, I don't. So, sometimes you do have to, it can feel like you lose the battle, so to speak, right? But my thought on that was, okay, like I'll give you the alternative assignment, and we still got a year's worth of class to go through. Trust me, like that kid's gonna get that exposure and those experiences as well.
I would like to invite Montserrat at this point to unmute and maybe share some of her questions. She's got a couple parts to her question.
Hi, I have a question. I'm a primary teacher, and also sometimes I teach with very young children from 3 to 6. And sometimes I realize that the reality of one of the children is different to the expected one in the matter of gender. So every time I wonder if I have to ask to act, working on acceptance of the reality and self-esteem, because sometimes the children don't even know what they feel. I mean, I'm sure that they know that they feel something different, but they don't really know. Most of the times families do not accept it by then, maybe in the future. But I always think if I should do act right now, as soon as I notice, or I should wait until until well, just to until something else happens. What do you think? Because I'm talking every time I'm talking about children under 12, right, from 3 to 12, and sometimes even when they are 3, you realize that something is happening.
Yeah, think that's a great question. And I mean, I will start by saying I'm not a primary or elementary educator, so there are some things here that I don't have that expertise. But as you were talking, I was remembering just things that I've read from some of my friends who are elementary educators, and I do want to start by saying that the children probably know. I mean, like I said, I knew by the time I was 5 that. I mean, I knew I was gay, but I didn't have the language. Like, I think one of the things with kids is they don't have that language that we use, but they feel it. I mean, I felt it. Like I said, I knew I probably shouldn't talk about it as well. So I would wager on the side of they probably do feel those things. I mean, that is a reality of their lived experience. I think that in primary and elementary school, you really have to. I mean, it's a different way we talk about it. We don't talk about it in the same kind of language we do in middle and high school. We talk about families. We talk about, what kind of clothes do you want to wear? Or what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And I think if you create that space where, you're working to get rid of the binary thinking. You're working to, disrupt and dismantle that cis heteronormativity that we all experience in our classrooms to some degree, and just make that space for that kid to feel supported, to feel affirmed by your actions. That child may never say anything to you, but they're going to remember, in her class, I felt good. I felt I could be more of myself. I mean, I don't think that we should, go in on Monday and say, all right, kids, like, I'm going to explode a rainbow in the classroom. Like, hello, welcome. I think that, bring in those picture books that show different types of families or different types of gender identities and expressions, in addition to the other books that we are using. One of the risks that we have when we do bring in LGBTQ content is to tokenize it. So it's like, look at this gay book. Great. Let's go back to the straight stuff. Look at this like trans book. Great. Let's go back to the cis stuff. So I think it's important to, make that space, work on our language and the ways in which we may be perpetuating these stereotypes and things. And then just to continue to bring in those topics and issues little by little. One of the things in the teaching tolerance guide they talk about is to do an audit of your classroom, like literally just like sit and look around your classroom and ask yourself, like, do I see ways in which I'm saying things about boys, things about girls, or things about families and love and relationships? And we may not think that those like posters say a lot, but they do. I mean, I have very vivid memories of posters in my elementary school classrooms where I looked at it and I had the language, but I was like, that's not me. And I don't see me anywhere. But I also think the fact that you're thinking about these things that's a good place to be in. So many teachers don't. They're like, okay, whatever. I hope that helped.
Yeah, and to even build on that, Josh, could you maybe comment on like how do we make sure that the students own that process of coming out? and that we, even though we notice these things in our students, that we don't, push that process, that is, and then somebody else in the chat, Lucia, also asked about the picture books, and do you have a source that maybe teachers could go to for a list of picture books, like as you talked about, to make them a commonplace in our classrooms?
Sure. So to your first point about, allowing students to own that process, I've had so many conversations with students. I mean, even like when I talk college level, okay, where they come to me and they're talking to me, and I can tell like they want to say something big to me, but I don't push it. I just, I say, okay, like I'm here if you want to say anything. A lot of times I think educators feel like we are owed student stories. I mean, I think about this not just in this realm, but even with, trauma informed education, for example. There are teachers who say things like, well, what happened to them? Like, I need to know that so I know how to react. Like, no, you just build those spaces. So yeah, it is important to remember that, like I was saying earlier, don't come in and like force that issue. Just open up that space for students to start to feel comfortable enough, build those relationships, work on building that trust with them, and they may not talk to you about it in the moment in that year you teach them. It may be years later when they message you on social media or email you or come back and like say those things too. As far as picture books, again, I'm not as adept in that realm. I often I know the American Library Association, I think it's ala.org. They put out lists of books every year. That's a place that I go to. If you have a librarian at your school, every librarian I've met, they are phenomenal, amazing people. And you say, I'm looking for a book like this, they can give you at least 3. So I would say reach out to those people. Ones that come to mind immediately, there's one about a crayon who I think it's called Red. He's a red crayon, but he wants to be a blue crayon, I think. And it's this conversation about gender identity and expression without being about gender identity and expression. There's Entango Makes 3. That's one that's always challenged in all the lists, about the 2 male penguins who adopt a penguin chick at a zoo. There's one I can't think. I'll come back to it if I can remember. But
Yeah, the book Red, he is a blue crayon, but he has a red wrapper. And so everybody calls him Red, but he sees himself as blue, and really trying to understand. A beautiful book. Yes. So I don't see, well, let's see. Okay. Luci. And how about even the challenge of using those texts Lucia mentions in a more conservative society? Okay, and I know, like, living in Virginia, especially living in rural Virginia a little bit, you're on that fringe of conservative a territory there often in Virginia, as we can see in some of our elections here, goes back and forth at times, right? And if it goes blue nationally, it goes red governorally or whatever, and so on. But how do you exist in that?
Yeah, that's another one of those things I had listed out. I wanted to have a conversation about. So I've taught in a very rural school. In my school now, we're pretty progressive in a lot of ways. But there still is this mix of various ideologies. I as much as it feels like you're not fighting enough or you're not doing enough, I think that you have to face your reality. You do have to work within the society, the culture that you are teaching in. I incorporated a lot of this kind of content when I was teaching at my very, very rural high school, by offering choice. I would, make sure that I would just include a text, among other things. Sorry. And if students wanted to read it, they couldn't, they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And then in, conversations when we came back together, we were all sharing our learning from all these different texts. Even if no student chose to do that, I would then bring that up. But by offering it as a choice, if a parent did, and I had parents email, I had parents call, all I said was, it was a choice. I'm not forcing your child into this. I think that's a good place to start. And that may be a place where you have to live for a while, because schools are part of communities, and schools take on the ideologies of their communities. And a lot of that work is also on, let's go outside the walls of the school and let's work on changing ideologies in those classrooms or in those communities as well. So often I think we want to just jump in and do it all so quickly, but we can't. I mean, if you think back to my talk, the first thing was educate yourself. If you yourself don't have that, and if you haven't done that internal work, do not go into your classroom Monday and start doing all this stuff, because it is dangerous. You don't know what kinds of stereotypes, what kinds of biases you're still perpetuating. I mean, it's not with LGBTQ things, but when I really started into the foray of becoming an anti-racist educator, I made a lot of mistakes. I hurt students. One of the things is because I jumped into it a little too fast. And then I had to, have those conversations with those students, apologize, and then, do the action. I mean, I think that the best way to apologize is through your actions. And so then I pulled back, and really did a lot of that self-work and that self-reflection. And I say that to highlight the fact that if you're in a conservative area, you may not be able to do as much as someone in a more liberal or more progressive society might be able to do. And I don't think we should compare ourselves either. I mean, you're doing great work. You and the fact of the matter is, every single one of us have LGBTQ students in our classrooms. We may not know it, but again, you're not owed your student stories, right? We're not owed those. So I would assume you do. And if you are doing these things little by little to get started, and then you build up to it more, you are helping students. And as we all know at this work, like, we often don't know how much we are helping until years later, or even at all. Yeah, that's all I got right now.
So I'm in the way you talked a lot about, like, as individual teachers, and I'm sorry that Judy had to step away from our conversation, but since this is recorded, I would love you to talk maybe even about the systems level of a school system, school district, of how important is it to have that like director of equity and inclusion officer in the system. How important is it for school principals and district leaders to maybe even make these systems brave spaces for the teachers to do this work, let alone on the individual level of only speaking to the teachers?
Yeah, it's super important to answer that question. So Judy, I mean, in her role, so in my school district this year, we have they're called equity leads. There's an equity lead in every middle or elementary, middle, and high school. And our role right now is really just to kind of get a sense of the lay of the land, so to speak, kind of feel the school climate out, and to create spaces for students to have these conversations. Our work right now is entirely focused on increasing self-awareness and promoting human values. I mean, this entire year, it is all about raising to the level of our consciousness, if we have not already done so, that critical self-work of looking at your own biases, and thinking about ways in which you have been perpetuating these stereotypes and how you can work, against that. I feel very, very lucky and very supported to have, Judy Diggs. And I mean, any sort of, you need those directors of equity and inclusion, because they have that authority. Like there is that authoritative power that comes in. Now, granted, I mean, in some school systems, that person is about this big, and as far as the central office staff goes, right? And that's unfortunately how it is in a lot of places, because people often see diversity work as like a checkbox, right? It's just like done. And by like diversity is not, it's inclusion, it's equity. That's the thing we really need to be striving for. So when you do have those administrators who not only give you that space to do that learning, but also support you in that learning, and protect you from any sort of pushback, that then allows teachers to be able to do more of this work. I mean, I've always been somebody who's going to go challenge the system, and I mean, I've always been like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I have to do that thing. Okay, how can I be subversive and kind of do that and do my own? Like that's me. But there are teachers who are not that way. I mean, I know teachers we've had conversations, and they're like, I really want to do this, and I did one little thing, but I'm very scared. And it's a very valid concern. Like I do not fault them. On some level, you got to have your job, right? And if we all start getting fired because we're doing this work, who's there doing the work? Nobody. So when you have that protection, it does make that space for more people to start doing the work. And I'm reminded of Paul Gorski and his work with the Equity Literacy Initiative, where he says, and there's a lot of scholars who've studied this stuff, the critical mass is 15%. If you have 15% of people in any group or organization doing something, that's all you need to get that work moving forward. And if we have those administrators who support this work, I think we can get to that 15%. Kind of, as quickly as we can. But again, this is not fast work. This is a big old marathon.
Yeah. And I think that 15% opens up a great space for a question from Liz Corson there. Liz, do you mind unmuting yourself and maybe talking through your question a little bit more?
Sure, thank you. And I'm sorry I'm late. I had the time down wrong. We sort of, because of a committee or a community group working in partnership with myself and some other teachers, we sort of forced our district's hand to start a DEI committee. So it was not a choice by the administration. It was a push, kind of a 15%. It wasn't 15%, but it was enough percent to, and it was this summer after George Wallace. So there was all eyes were on equity. But we don't have support from administration, particularly from the superintendent. So I'm just wondering, so we're sort of at a standstill a little bit. There's certainly meetings of the DEI, there's talk, but there's not talk about hiring an equity officer or even a teacher on assignment. One of the teachers who started this community group would be a fantastic teacher on assignment, and she's willing, she wants it, but there's not been commitment to her. So I don't know, beyond, continuing to work with the community, that's what we feel like the only way change happens is if parents, family members talk to the board. It seems that it has to go that way publicly. Letters don't seem to be that successful somewhat, but it seems to be more like publicly speaking to the board. But so all of this is really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, but those two are the ones that, got a lot of the attention. A lot of schools put out all these anti-racist statements, and they're like, we support all these things. And now's the time to hold them to that. I mean, I think there is nothing wrong by saying, you did this. Hello, where's the work? And I'm glad that you mentioned getting the community involved. I mean, that was the first thing I thought about. If you have those parents or community members who feel strongly about this work, ask them to start going to board meetings and saying, you have this statement, where's your action? Like, until I see action, there's nothing that's going to happen. And you may have to be with your committee for a little bit before that work gets done. I mean, as we all know, I'm sure district administration loves data. And if you can show there is good work here, this needs to be supported. I think that might go a long way. But I mean, if you can get board members, I mean, the school board members are the ones who have all the power in a lot of these situations, and they can force districts to do whatever. If you have a education association, I mean, that's another group you can bring in to do this advocacy work. as well. And I often, anytime I do things, I survey students in the beginning and I survey them at the end. And I have that data there. So I can say, look, here are 6 semesters worth of data that shows that students feel more supported. Students feel whatever it is. And I've been able to actually get things to go my way because I had those surveys. It's nothing official from like the school board, but it is in your own classroom. And it's hard work, persistent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My cat is making an appearance here with us today, folks. Man, he's trying to get in
Mine
my
are too.
way.
Where they are.
But this also opens up a question that Corey posed in the chat. So Corey, would you mind unmuting yourself and sharing your question?
Yeah. Hey, Josh. So what can community members do? Community members who work with students outside of school, like coaches and scout troop leaders, and even like the after school sort of orgs that work with STEM or STEAM or anything like that. What can we do to help support students and to make more inclusive spaces?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. Let me start by saying those are still educational spaces. So I think that everything I talked about, I know I talked about it with, teachers in schools, but I think that all those things can apply. It's going to look differently, right? Because you're not in the classroom, but, I think if you are educating yourself, you are working to disrupt cis heteronormativity in that space you're working in. That can go a long way. If you build those relationships with students or with teens and adolescents and kids at that point, to build that trust. You might be that person they come out to. You might be that person that they see as a support because none of their teachers do. There are a lot of teachers out there who are the only ones in a giant building who do any of this work. And so students often get that support extracurricularly. I got a lot of that, when I was in school, marching and band saved my life. That was sort of my lifeline. I think everything I said definitely applies. And then to work with teachers and to push school boards and go to school board meetings and say, look, like I'm a community member. I work with your students. They tell me these things because teachers can speak up, and we do have that. Like we have that experience, very intimate exposure to kids. Every day we see them and we know them way more than board members do. But for a lot of teachers, they're afraid to go. We are afraid to go because we might get fired, but they can't fire you if you have nothing to do with the school.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I also like, thinking, and sometimes with those community organizations, you have a much longer time span with our students. You see them across the years. You see them for maybe 2, like even with your band experience and everything like that, it was 2 to 3 hours of your day, potentially, instead of just a 40-minute period, like many teachers. So the relationship value of you as community member is huge. And I think, you often will be the first person that they feel close enough to reveal such information. So. All right. I'm not sure if I'm seeing much of any other. I know we've had a few late joinees and such, and so perhaps maybe a short little segment of maybe a final message of of how do you take like maybe what are some of the next steps for people, maybe even to summarize some of the big ideas that you've shared today, so that everybody feels that they're walking away with the big messages.
So I'm going to go back to those 3 points. Educate yourself. Like if you don't know hardly anything, that's step 1. Teaching tolerance, Glisten. Those are 2 great resources. If you're a podcast person, there are plenty of podcasts out there that give that history, that talk about, that can give you some good education. Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime. Well, Amazon, Netflix and Hulu Uh, those, I mean, there are so many documentaries and like TV shows out there and movies. And if we're not getting those messages that center LGBTQ people, that that is your perspective. That's your worldview, right? And so, especially if you don't live in an area where you have a thriving, queer community, though, that's the way you can get that exposure to push your thinking. I would say start building relationships with, I mean, not if you ain't already building relationships with students, you got something wrong. Continue to build the relationships with students, so that they do start to feel that they can trust you. Stand up to homophobia and transphobia. If you hear kids saying these things, and we know what happens in the hallway, we know what happens in our classrooms, right? And it can be scary. An easy way to do it is to say, no, that we're not going to have that. That's homophobic, and that does not exist in this classroom or in my space. No, and just shut it down. And then start to do an audit of your texts and resources and ask yourself whose voices and experiences are included and whose are not. And then do your research to find ways to fill in those gaps. But education, the internal self-work is number one.
And
Real
oh, go
quick,
ahead.
Jack.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was something from Andres from Spain. He mentioned how can we manage a situation between, when the educational system and the individual background don't match. And I wanted to add to that, how can we implement this in an international school context in which we have a lot of backgrounds, and maybe teachers who feel uncomfortable having these conversations, but they kind of want to have them, but they feel uncomfortable. How do we motivate them to start doing it?
Yeah, phenomenal question. Thank you, Andres. So, I mean, individual students are going to bring, I mean, every person comes into a classroom and brings their own identities and their own experiences and backgrounds. And, when you first start doing this work and incorporating LGBTQ content, you're probably going to get students who, that can be a triggering thing for them. They can very much say, oh, this goes against what I believe or my family believes. And as I said earlier, if you offer choice, I have had a lot of success by giving students choice of things. If you don't want to read this text or you don't want to do this, we can do this other thing. And then when you have those whole class conversations and come back together, you can talk about aspects of those texts and those resources. Again, building relationships with kids. I keep coming back to that, because if you have the relationship with that student who does not, feel comfortable with this kind of content, you can have those one-on-one conversations and talk to them and say, what's going on? Like, what about this? Here's why I'm doing this. I'm not forcing this on you at all. The fact of the matter is, queer people exist in the world. We've been here as long as everybody else has been here. I think a lot about Kelly Wickham Hurst. She talks about, so we have microaggressions, but she talks about macro affirmations. And her work a lot is with working and supporting Black students, but it applies here too. If, cis students, heterosexual students, if they do not get this exposure to any kind of queer content at all, they have a very skewed worldview. And so the macro affirmation comes in to say, well, the world is all cisgender and straight. And so when they go out into the world, they experience a lot of, it's hard because the world's not that way. And so it's also helping to prepare students just for the reality of the world. Thinking about Juan Carlos's question of, an international school with lots of different backgrounds, building community is important. A community of educators. If you happen to have someone at your school, that's phenomenal. And I would lean on them, because this work is hard. It's, it doesn't feel good sometimes, like in our bodies, my heart races and I get sweaty because I'm, it's the fight or flight response that comes in. But if you had that community to lean on, that's a phenomenal way also to help out. And again, if you don't feel comfortable to have these conversations, educate yourself. You know, if you don't feel like you have enough to be able to have the conversation, you have to do that work, you know, the internal work first, that self work first. And I also want to say, like, it's not that if you educate yourself, it's not going to feel uncomfortable anymore, right? These are difficult conversations sometimes to have. But if you've done that work, you have a lot of those experiences and that knowledge to come back from. Yeah, internal work and relationships with kids, like that's always going to be what I say.
Yeah, you know, Josh, you know, I am a fanboy of yours. I've been following you on Twitter for years and everything. So, you know, it made my day when we could invite you in for this conversation. And I know everyone in our audience really appreciates your knowledge, your thinking, and your willingness to share, you know, ideas and even your own perspectives on things. I know I joined Juan Carlos in that appreciation for you being with us today. And I'll let Juan Carlos have our final messages for our community.
Can I just say thank you? Like, this is phenomenal. Like, I'm still like on cloud nine. Like I don't, yeah, just thank you so much. This is phenomenal to be able to speak with educators from around the world about something that I, you know, have very near and dear to my heart. And I mean, folks, I'll put my Twitter handle in the chat. I am always down to have these conversations and to continue it. I talk about community, and I am now part of your community if you want to have me. So that is a way to reach